there is a concept of the silver medal syndrome, where also silver medalists are sometimes, when they've been interviewed or looked at facial expressions on a podium, that sometimes silver medalists are the least happy because they feel they're one step off something that's kind of perfection.
Messy and masterful. In this podcast, we speak about the success of people who have achieved, built, or done something amazing, special, remarkable, noteworthy, and/or fabulous. Think of presidents, doctors, chefs, architects, filmmakers, writers, philosophers, CEOs, journalists, and the list goes on and on of people who've had a genuine impact on this world. But rather than underlining their career victories, we speak about the challenges they needed to overcome to actually get there. In each episode, we discuss 3 of such challenges, obstacles, difficulties, and/or hurdles with our guest, putting the messy of their lives next to the masterful. A very warm welcome to you. My name is Aldo de Pap, and I'm so happy you could make it. So sit back, relax, and download the podcast here.
Hello. The warmest of welcomes to you, my dear listener. Very happy you could make it. This is an episode for those of you who seek to win, for those of you who seek victory, for those of you who want to conquer the world. I had the greatest privilege of talking to Cath Bishop, and Cath Bishop is an Olympic rower, and she participated in not 1, not 2, but 3 Olympic Games, and even won silver for rowing. So with the British rowing team, ladies, she won a silver medal, which is quite an achievement. And if that is not enough, after her rowing career, she became a war diplomat, and she worked on very complex cases in extremely troubled areas in this world, and we talk about all of that. Cath assembled all her wisdom as an Olympian as well as a war diplomat, and has written a book about it. It's called The Long Win, and we talk about this book as well in this episode. On top of that, Cath is coaching loads of companies, but also loads of schools and teachers about what it means to win and how you can collaborate into winning, or whatever your purpose is. I'd highly recommend you listen to this interview. I don't think I've ever have spoken to someone who's just so grounded about it all, who doesn't really think she's done anything special. And while by any standard it's of course an amazing achievement, and it's really very inspiring to listen to all the advice that Cath Bishop can give you. So I sincerely hope you enjoy Episode 77, interview with Cath Bishop, the Olympian. Yes, and a very warm welcome to a new episode of Messy and Masterful. Now, I've always said these interviews are about people with amazing professions, vocations, or kind of missions and projects in life. And I felt so privileged that over the previous seasons we've had some great people on, and this guest is absolutely no exception, because I have here Olympian Cath Bishop. A very warm welcome to you, Cath.
Hi, great to be here, Aldo.
Cath, I was so excited when you said yes to this interview. You came highly recommended via Alison Jones, who I believe through the publishing. And was she the publisher for your book, The Long Win?
Yes, she was.
Yes. Well, to start with that, I asked, which book, kind of all the books you published, was your favorite? She declined to answer. Because, of course, she shouldn't say her favorites, like saying who's my favorite child.
Exactly.
But then later on in the interview, she came back to, one of the books that I'm very passionate and that inspired me very much so is The Long Win by Cath Bishop.
That means a lot.
Yeah, and then if you ever have the time, then listen to the interview with Alison Jones where she speaks about you. But she really introduced me to the world of an Olympian, of course, as a complete bystander and as an armchair expert. And I hope that we can dive into that, because that's, of course, what your achievement is. And first of all, a big congrats on that. Just for people who do not know you, could you talk a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, so I guess that's probably the first thing that I was known for is, as an Olympic rower. And actually, I wasn't very sporty as a child, and I got into rowing at university by chance. And it became this incredible journey. And I went to 3 Olympic Games. And at that level, you're training 3 times a day, 7 days a week, most weeks of the year. I mean, it's about sort of each session's maybe about 2 hours. So it's 6 hours of physical training basically every day. It's your life trying to make a boat go backwards up a lake a little bit faster each day. It's a team sport, and I loved being on the river. So the actual sport was one I fell in love with very quickly, and then that in a way that helped me, I think, to get through some of the more brutal times that came when you're part of an Olympic campaign. So that was my sort of first career. I then had a really different career working as a diplomat for the British Foreign Office, and specialised in conflict issues around the world. And I now work in the space of leadership and culture with all sorts of organisations across business, across education, across sport, helping leaders to think about what's required for people in the organisations to thrive, to explore their performance potential, and do great work.
So this is... Basically, we should have had 3 interviews and call it differently, because this interview is titled The Olympian. I've already decided, because we're going to start with The Olympian as an intro, but we could have also easily called it The War Diplomat and then The Motivator. So / it will be. You said it very quickly, but how does one, you say, I wasn't very sporty, and then all of a sudden you qualify for the Olympics. How does that go? So at which age did you start rowing?
I started at 18, and I definitely wasn't immediately in the Olympics. So I basically started at university, and very much for fun, no aspirations. And I think in a way that helped me to just fall in love with the sport. I was in it. I hadn't really been able to enjoy sport as a child. I hadn't been very good. I'd felt very self-conscious. The teachers had told me I wasn't very good. My family wasn't very sporty. And so it didn't really feel something I could access. And then by chance, I didn't say that I wanted to row because it looked very full on when they were asking people who wanted to sign up and try it. But by chance, I got invited to have a go when someone was injured in the beginner's crew. And that just opened up to me a really different world, a different experience. I loved being on the river. I loved the interdependence you have within a rowing crew. So at school on the hockey pitch, I'd been able to opt out. I'd stand there, I'd run away from the ball, or I'd just, not move. But actually, once you're in a rowing boat, you can't do that. You've got to take the next stroke because there's someone coming up behind you, and you have to opt in, if you like. So I had this wonderful experience of opting in to being part of a team. You're very interdependent. You can't have someone who isn't pulling their weight. Equally, you can't do more than your proportion. If you're in a crew of 4, you're a quarter of that. You can't be more than a quarter of that. So there's lots of sort of depth, I think, to the team experience that it opens up. And I loved the environment. I loved kind of starting to learn how to really work with people alongside you. We had a lot of fun. And over time, through the 4 years I was at university, I was creeping up standards, both in my own fitness and in technique. I had some really good coaches. I went from a sort of very recreational level to a serious representing the university in the boat race, in the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. And that sort of took me to a level just beneath the national squad, but with, my coaches saying you have the potential, perhaps, to go to the Olympics. So, at that point, you have to have a go, don't you? And so that sort of set me on the track. So it was a good 6 years up to the first Olympics from starting. Yeah. So it certainly wasn't overnight, although that's still reasonably quick.
Yeah, and this is all alongside your academic formation, because you were, this is a side job essentially, but a very extensive one. Right?
It is. Yeah. Once I got to the Olympic team, then, sort of not straight away, but that became full time. And in fact, the Olympics that I went to in Atlanta in 1996 and Sydney in 2000 and Athens in 2004 was a transition time where a system was being created, if you like, where Olympic athletes could be more full-time. So
Yeah.
once I was at that level, it was pretty much my main job. Although actually I still tried to keep on some studies and some other things just for sanity, for a little bit of balance in my life.
Yeah. We're going to talk more about that balance later, because thank you for also submitting your 3 challenges that we discuss, with each of our guests in each interview. And you write something very interesting in your first challenge, because your first challenge really that you encountered was these poor, as you say, poor performance at your first Olympics. You came in 7th at the first Olympics, and then that built up. And I guess because you only get every 4 years to prove yourself, that's a long cycle really to kind of make it work, and also very short slots to kind of say, okay, I'm now going to do better. So that sounds like an enormous pressure, is it not?
Yeah. I mean, so I went to 3 in total. I actually had poor performances at the first and the second, and it was probably the second almost that was even harder, because I think the first spurred me on to think, right, okay, I know what I need to do now. I'd only been in the national team a couple of years before the first one, and I thought, right, now I get a chance for 4 years to kind of do everything that I can, and then, I'll make good. And so it's almost the sort of the experience of the first and then the second actually not coming good that compounded that challenge more. But I think it also, what was difficult was it was a very brutal experience. It was a hard environment to thrive in. At that point, the culture was all about who's the toughest person. You could show no weakness. And so, as well as having poor performances, I felt, well, I haven't really enjoyed this. And I don't actually feel I've, been able to explore how good I could be. I still felt that there could be a different way. And so, that was brutal. Part of the culture then also meant that you started to associate your own value with the result. And that's a really dangerous thing. It's a very slippery slope, whether you're an Olympic athlete or a teacher or a lawyer. Once we start to somehow think that we're proving ourselves through our job, then, we're really leaving ourselves vulnerable to things beyond our control that could go wrong with our job at any time, particularly if you're an athlete. And so it's this sense that, I was worth more when I did well, and I was worth less when when I did less, when my boat went slower. And that also made those results really devastating, because not only had I lost at the Olympics, I'd somehow lost some self-worth in that. And that, of course, is a very, very vulnerable position to be in, and a very frightening position, a very devastating position to be in. You sort of start to see this as a vehicle of this is going to show what I'm capable of, and it hasn't. And then somehow I'm no longer capable. And I think it's often, you see it in stories of athletes, because it's so easy to be seen as the Olympian, to be seen as, your whole life start to revolve around this one narrow pursuit, and other people start to identify you with that. But actually having a broader identity is really important. And that's what I went on to discover. And there is research that tells us more about that as well. And it's not just because it helps us to be, to thrive. It actually helps that Olympic performance as well. So, none of this was really being discussed in those early years. So I felt very much sort of trapped in my head, trapped in a, just more is better, trying to do more, trying to be tougher, trying to be meaner, harder on myself. And that's an exhausting process.
I can imagine. And basically there was no kind of pause in that, and your peers, so your co-athletes who were in the boat with you, weren't giving you that relief either, because they were also very hard, if not hard on themselves and then hard on you. In those days, and this might have changed, was there any kind of psychological support for you guys? Was there a coach saying, okay, now it's time to chill, now it's time to, not be as hard on yourself? What does that look like, kind of that trajectory?
No, essentially not, or not very sophisticated. And again, that was what changed then in my third Olympics, where we started to have more access, and I was able to start finding more to read about sports psychology. But it wasn't really on what was presented. Arguably everyone around you is having a psychological influence on you. What we weren't doing was cleverly, and intentionally developing our psychological capability, or it was all centered around this sort of macho narrative of who's the toughest. And so, again, there was lots of chat about, from coaches or just from others around you in that environment, whether it's sports scientists, whether it's other athletes, there was this sort of incessant narrative around winning. And at first I just thought, well, that's natural. We're in a high performance environment. That must be what it's like. How would I know? Because I've got nothing to compare this to. And, I felt I was coming in very much to learn about what's required to perform in the Olympics. So I looked around me and thought, well, I have to do everything that I can see around me. And that was a toughness. And there was this sort of macho talk about winning. And people were labelled as winners or losers, even though everybody here was on the Olympic team or aspiring to be on the Olympic team. And there was a lot of, I can remember coaches saying, have you got what it takes to win? And I remember thinking, I don't know. And how do I find that out? And what if I haven't? I would sort of torture myself. What if they find me out? The classic imposter syndrome. What if I'm not a winner and everybody else around me is? So this very narrow rhetoric was very damaging. But that's as far as it got. And that's been part of, for me uncovering that doesn't help anyone. And yet there is, we still see that winning narrative around us in marketing, in Hollywood, everywhere, and in some sports places as well, who haven't really understood what sports psychology has moved on to become.
I think we're looking for the supernatural in a way, and we give that praise. We say, oh, wow, specifically with athletics is like at a certain point you want something that from a human perspective might not be possible, just trying to outdo each other, which is also with these records, world records and better, best. And then at a certain point it's like, well, maybe it's just not feasible anymore, and why don't we give each other a break? But we you cannot ask human beings to do that for some reason, right? Which I think is a defect.
I think it's important to say I'm not against the pursuit of excellence at all. Yeah. And in fact, what I could see was I was burnt out for a lot of that time. Well, that's not good for performance.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd played to the rules of trying to do more and beat everybody, but actually I'd failed. So it was a very unsmart, if you can use that word, approach.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying we shouldn't be trying. I think we should be smarter about how we pursue excellence. And that then means understanding how actually working with people around us is much more effective.
Yeah.
And it happens to also be more enjoyable. Yeah. How, yes, sometimes rest and recovery is the key to going faster. And it's that sort of smartness. I think people almost have a sense of there's a binary, either you're trying to win or you don't care. And I think what I'm trying to do is say, no, there are other ways to win. There are better ways in which to, I talk about sort of pursuing excellence. That's what we're after, and being able to sustain it. Yeah. Because actually in most people's lives, it's not about a one-off race or a one-off kind of occasion. It's actually about how can we reach what we're capable of, and then sustain that under the pressure of our jobs, of increasing demands, and that then means what's around us, the environment, is really crucial.
And then there's the achievement by the kind of Olympic standards, which is the silver medal, correct? How did that make you feel? Was this the, now looking back, was this the crown on your work? Is it as magical as it looks like? Take us backstage. Take us behind the screens.
So I have to say, I think that kind of moment has probably had the biggest impact on me, because it's also sort of stayed with me as how do I make sense of that moment, and what does it mean, and what does it mean to others, and what do I want it to mean? And so it's really been a kind of driving force, probably. I think in terms of, on the day, on the race, we had by that third Olympics, so things had changed in the environment. Not everything had changed, and there was still a sort of, there always has to be a certain toughness to the demands, and again, I don't think that needs to change. But things were changing. We were pitted against each other much less. We were trying to learn from each other, which is something that definitely hadn't been around in the previous two Olympics. And I had come with a much greater sense of, success was going to be broader than the medal. I still wanted the medal, but I also wanted to go about it in a way that meant, I could recover properly. I would start thinking about my mindset beyond just being the toughest person out there, that I would think about building relationships and, that weren't just people who happened to be in the same environment, people who, where we really understood each other more. We could support and challenge each other.
There is no point in denying it. I am in love. And you might have already known it, that I was in love with podcasting and interviewing people all over the world. Well, I'm also in love now with a recording tool for our podcast episodes, which is called Riverside.fm. I've kissed many frogs when it came to recording episodes, but this one is really the one with the most amazing studio features. Riverside really offers you everything you need in creating the perfect episode, whether these are short or long, whether these are multiple people you're talking to or just you, or whether this is about your show notes or the video recording or even creating easy snippets that you can use on social media. Riverside truly has it all. If you go to our show notes, you will find a link to Riverside, and if you use that link, you'll even get a 20% discount. Yes, you heard that correctly, a 20% discount in getting started with this incredible podcast recording tool. Look no more. Riverside.fm is here.
And so, the whole experience had been different. And I was thinking all the time, I want to have something that I can take away from this Olympics, whether I win a medal or not. I want to win one, but I know good people don't.
Yeah.
And I know really dedicated, really hardworking athletes don't win medals. I know that personally. And so I want something else so that I'll be able to take away. But of course, by focusing on these other elements that were all important to performance as well, it raised the standard up. That meant actually I was in the hunt for medals. And I think, that meant that the way we approached that race was slightly different. I mean, we actually had all sorts of challenges that year. My rowing partner, I was in two of us, a pair. She had a terrible injury at the beginning of the year with her back. We had all kinds of uncertainties, as probably a lot of athletes do, or a lot of us in life do. But we were switching to sort of thinking not so much, I have to win, which is kind of what I'd sat on the start line at 2 previous Olympics thinking, and come nowhere near it. Yeah. But here we were much more thinking, how fast can we go? How fast can we make our boat go? How close can we get to the best 250 strokes possible? And so in terms of that, I think we did a pretty good job on the day. And that was an important measure. And almost the fact that's what our aim was, I think helped us to get really close to that on the day. Yeah. And then, afterwards, there's almost a sort of a mixed feeling because, of course, no one has a plan to come second. And so, by that, and of course, all around us, there is that only winning counts narrative. So I think there was a sort of reckoning moment of, okay, well, now we've got to work out, am I the first loser, which that old macho narrative would say, or, what have I gained? But I think also there was a sort of joy about, at the end of a race, you only have 6 in a rowing final. So 3 go back to the boat tents and 3 go towards the podium. And basically previous, I'd gone in that direction back home, just feeling everything was sort of devastated and destroyed. And to be told, like you're turning around and you're going that way and you're going towards where the crowds are and you're going to be part of an Olympic ceremony, that was just really joyous, really joyous to be, to feel part of that and to feel that actually all of those things I'd learned had helped my performance as well. And so, it's a whole cauldron of emotions.
Yeah. I can imagine. I think it's interesting what you say. It's like no one, does the race to come in second, right? But then there's a tension with, well, I do want a medal. So then you would say, well, you would accept bronze or silver, or naturally gold is the best. But so there's a tension there with like, okay, so you were standing there and you would say, well, it should have been gold, or was that? Did that go through your mind, or was that not at all? Did you say like,
of course, of course, okay. And I think that there had been an additional pressure that actually no women rowers had ever won a gold medal, and so there was this build-up. In fact, none had won any medals until the previous Olympics, where there had been 1 silver medal, and so there was this sort of also this desire to break this boundary, to prove people wrong who are saying the women won't win. So there was that sense of maybe we could be those history makers. So I think there was a sense of, gosh, that slipped. Yeah. But I also, I've sort of read a lot around this, and there is a concept of the silver medal syndrome, where also silver medalists are sometimes, when they've been interviewed or looked at facial expressions on a podium, that sometimes silver medalists are the least happy because they feel they're one step off something that's kind of perfection. And in fact, for a while, I was actually going to write a book about silver medalists because nobody does. But one of the reasons why I sort of got sidetracked and to write the book I did was that actually, when I interviewed lots of gold medalists, they weren't very happy.
Oh, they weren't
They
happy
would
either.
also feel depressed or empty or unfulfilled. And sometimes the bronze medalists felt really excited because they're going, we're not fourth, and we're kind of at the party.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, you can find happy and unhappy medalists of each colour, because it actually isn't about the medal, it's about your expectations. And it's then when you get the medal, it's about what the medal represents beyond the fact on the day it's nice, it's round your neck. What do you take away? Once the cameras have gone, what are you left with? It's just an inanimate object. It's quite pretty, it's on a ribbon, but it just goes in a desk because there isn't, of itself, it doesn't change your quality of life, it doesn't change your personality flaws or your relationship issues. What does it represent? And that's what's so important. And I think that's this kind of concept of the long win that I've been developing. It's the same, you could apply it to school grades. They're great when you open the envelope if you've done well. But actually, it's what you take into the next part of your life that matters. What are the stories, the relationships, the experiences I had that are of lasting value from that medal? And there are many, and even this journey I've been on, that is, that's been an important part of. And to that extent, it is of just enormous value to me.
Yeah. Two questions come to mind. First is when you say gold medalists aren't happy. Was there something recurring that you saw in their unhappiness? Were they all unhappy about the same thing, or were they just, had they not felt it through, kind of how the medal would
what
impact
I
them?
found was that it's about our definition of success. If it was literally just about getting the medal, then often you're left with an emptiness because it is just an object. And where there was nothing that it represented, a community of people who were on this journey with you, whose lives that you were part of, or who'd maybe changed, or, if it had no sort of greater purpose, then athletes were often left very empty. Certainly if they'd had a poor experience along the way and you kind of go, is that it? I've gone through all of this. Think of what's happened in the sport of gymnastics, for example. You go all through all this and this is it, and it's temporary. It's what's the lasting value that is really important. So I think if you look at like the FIFA Women's Cup, for example, you saw lots of women's football teams, whether they were from Australia or Nigeria or the UK, who, yes, they absolutely wanted to win. That's not going away, but there's this bigger sense of purpose that actually what we're doing is enabling, the next generation of girls to dream that they can play football or they can just follow their dream. And so you find that athletes and teams are wanting to create some deeper human meaning to their pursuit of excellence. And that is what helps you in those difficult moments. It's what helps you to perform under pressure. Because you feel connected to this broader community. It's really what we need to thrive. We want to feel we belong to something. And so when athletes had become very isolated, just pursuing this brilliant performance, and they achieved it, but felt there was no human connection, nothing of lasting value once they stepped off the podium, then they're left with that lack of fulfillment.
What comes to mind, that's my second point, and then we'll dive into your second challenge, which is going into your life as a war diplomat, which I'm also fascinated with, is the absurdity of a prize in general, of an award in general. Because when you hear people, whether I've heard people who won the Nobel Prize or people who won an Academy Award, and there's just such an enormous build-up. And then it's just like emptiness after that. So I've heard actors saying, well, it wasn't that my Academy Award got me more work. If anything, the phone stopped ringing, right? Because people thought all of a sudden I was going to be very picky or, so they didn't come around with other types of roles. And I still needed roles to pay the bills, right? We forget that actors are, people that need their income as well, right? And I think with this year, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, sorry, I do apologize, her name escapes me, but she said like 5 years ago, no one wanted to even offer me a job, right? So she found like the RNA in the COVID vaccine. So it's, an enormous achievement and whatever. She said 5 years ago, I was about to lose my job. No one wanted to give me a position. I didn't make any money. And now look at me, I've got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. So I think our thinking as humans with the concept of a prize is just slightly flawed. I mean, the build-up is so enormous. Yeah. And so you're right, there's nothing but, there's emptiness after that. So that needs to be managed somehow, or, support needs to be given to people who won, kind of, what's next almost.
Yeah. Where I go to is actually defining success beyond that. So the medal is only a part of your picture of success. And that's what the concept of the long win is, where, sure, it's great to have that, but actually it's something I can't control. I mean, certainly in the world of awards, you're kind of at the mercy of the bias of the judges and, who knows? And in fact, there's a whole industry of awards in the sort of business world that is largely, if you can almost buy one if your company sponsors them. I mean, it's really quite shallow and meaningless. So I think we have to be careful. I mean, I don't mind recognizing people who've done great things, but actually you want to think always about that greater contribution, the lasting element of it. So that, again, that Nobel Prize winner was not doing it in order to win the prize. No. So it's lovely. It's a lovely appreciation. Yeah. But actually what drove her was the purpose, her vocation, her curiosity that she could help mankind through looking at this issue and persisting in the face of all of that resistance. And I think when we're thinking about resilience and challenges that you talk to lots of people about, one of the things that can help us in those difficult moments is if we're doing something that's meaningful, not for the prize. That's not what helps you when it gets difficult. It's the fact that I'm doing something that is actually helping others, that is advancing knowledge or education or our learning in some way. Yeah. And if we define success, then that helps us through the difficult times. And sure, we may pick up some medals along the way, but that's not the only definition. And that's where we've got sort of trapped because of this sort of industry, and newspapers are short-termist, so they drive towards it, fits them perfectly. Today's medalist, tomorrow's medalist is someone else. This sort of short-termism. But for us as humans, that does not help us to thrive or to explore, actually what are we capable of? It will hold us back, and that's frustrating. That actually, driving for a medal or for a trophy actually is probably going to make us less resilient, less creative, and less able to enjoy the experience.
What you're saying reminds me of a philosopher that was also a guest on our podcast. He's a happiness philosopher, and he just published a book on Blue Monday about how come we as human beings, why are we not happier, right? So we tend to be more unhappy than we need to be. And there's this entire kind of story around, us growing up in prehistoric times that we need to be alert. So therefore, loads of things we see as a threat, right? Yeah. But media also works on our mind that way. Yes. Kind of a media thing, social media, something that is completely unrelated to us, will give us that alertness and therefore will make us unhappy. And he says basically our drive to become happy are what you also said, these short-termisms. Yeah. That, every time we're going to look for that boost. Because whatever it is, we're going to look for that endorphin, which, the likes on social media is taking that as an example. Yes. And it says the only thing that actually gives us true happiness, really in a sustainable level, is when we start giving and contributing to a situation that is bigger than ourselves. Yes. Right? Whether this is giving to others, or whether it is contributing to via a community center or whatever. But that is something that can perpetually help us grow and makes us happy in the most profound sense of the word. Anything else is basically our short-termisms. We fall off because there's going to be this moment like, okay, it made me happy, but now what's the next thing? Like we go to McDonald's, we want that hamburger and those fries, and then after we ate it, what's next?
Yeah.
Next menu or kind of whatever.
Yeah, and it's a sort of addiction part of our brain, isn't it? So that plays to what is how a gambler's mind would work. I want the hit, I want the win, and then I want the next one and the next one. And that's, what we're overusing. Whereas actually we have another part of our brain where we want to be part of progress. We want to be learning, and the path of human progress that sees us get to the moon or discover all these things. That is a deep drive within us as well. And that's the part that we want to tune into more when we're defining what does success look like.
Yeah. Wonderful, Kath. We can stay for years in a row in the Olympics. But now let's go to your past as a war diplomat. So while you are training for the Olympics, where were you reading? Where were you studying? And which university?
I studied languages, and then I did a master's in international politics.
Okay, and then becoming a diplomat is also not something that's not a job ad, right? You need to apply, I think, to the department and then Foreign Affairs, and I think the selection is quite strict. So here again, this is quite a competitive trajectory to get in there. Yeah,
it is.
So you're shrugging it off, but that's quite an accomplishment.
Well, like any of these, I don't shy away from going into a
good challenge.
Trying it out. Actually, it was something I was always interested in. And I think there were lots of other spaces in that world where I would also have been happy to contribute. I thought, well, let's see if this opens up. But if not, then I'll, there are lots of international organizations you can work with. The door did open. But that's what I was really interested in when I was, for my studies, before I went on this kind of big amazing rowing sort of journey. And so I actually joined after the second Olympics. So I thought, I was so devastated, and I thought I'd lost all belief. And I just thought, I've totally failed. I felt ashamed of the result. There's no way back for me. And so I thought, right, I need to go and do something different. And I literally thought, well, I'm going to see if this door opens and give it a go. And it did. And so I joined then in sort of 2001. And actually it was really helpful for me to get my mind away, to get a completely different perspective. A crazy perspective from going, 1 minute, the most important thing in the world is my boat going backwards on a river. And then suddenly I literally got the biggest perspective of all of, world politics and the huge issues at stake. But it gave me a massive dose of perspective to look back on the rowing period. And pretty quickly, I was thinking, I want to have another go because I think I can. I still don't feel I've explored what I'm capable of. I want to have another go. I want to do it differently. So, within a sort of 18 months, I was back training. I never really stopped a decent level of training, but within 18 months I was sort of back training really seriously, and then took a year out for the Athens Olympics and went straight away after the Athens Olympics, literally within a month, to my first foreign posting, which was to Sarajevo, the beautiful city of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
And what was your first assignment? What was it around? Because you say you're specifically focused on post-war zones, or was it?
That was within a sort of 10 years after the end of the Civil War in the 90s. And I had always a sort of political negotiating brief. And so it's a rebuilding brief. You're trying to help that country to, in particular, get an independent legal system up and running and set up courts so they could, try and prosecute war criminals. And, you're in a rebuilding phase, really helping them reform parts of, any part from the security forces to education was in a massive mess. It's still challenging, still hugely challenging. But into a world of relationships and thinking about human behavior on a big stage.
Yeah. And as your second challenge, you describe a situation in Basra. So could you quickly take me through the countries you were assigned to, and because how long were you a diplomat for?
So I was a diplomat for sort of nearly 12 years. And I worked in Sarajevo, and I worked for the British Embassy, and then I was seconded into the international organisation called the Office of the High Representative that oversees the upholding of the peace agreement that was signed at the end of the war in 1995. And after that, came back and worked in London, and then went to southern Iraq, to Basra, during the conflict in 2007 to 8. And that's where I was then, really kind of experiencing in conflict situation. And it was, really tough and, really a very violent, hostile environment, which we couldn't move freely. We were actually living on an airport base that had become the military base just outside the town. And there was incoming rockets, incoming mortars most days, sirens going off. Any movements around the base, you are with an armoured car. You're wearing, you've always got your hard helmet and your kind of flak jacket with you. And so, that was a kind of real challenge of this time, pressure in a very kind of real and present way.
Yeah, I can imagine it must be so confusing to bring anything to an outcome, really, when there's so much chaos around you, right? It sounds like an extremely complex situation. How did you manage to navigate? How did you manage to complete something, or to kind of...
I think, to some extent I had been very curious to see what does diplomacy look like in such an environment, and the answer is it's difficult, and it's essentially when you're into a conflict situation, diplomacy has failed, and all of the normal tools you have of relationships and communication is very difficult. So therefore you're in a place where those levers are not working well, and we couldn't move freely. So again, all of the things you might typically do to go and meet people and connect and talk, we couldn't. It was very difficult even to set up meetings. So you're working on the phone a lot. You really don't have the full picture of things. So it's really difficult to be effective. But at that sort of whole decade when I was working as a diplomat was very defined by the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so it's where a lot of the money was going. It's a lot of public attention was going, where ministerial attention was going. So you sort of had to understand them in all of their messiness, certainly, and mistakes and poor judgment that had got us into those mess. Now, obviously, I'm not there. I'm not a politician. I'm not saying it's good or bad to be there. That's not my task, and that's not my job. My job is to, once I'm there, see what ways we can stabilise the situation to create a political way out, because it's never a military solution. It's always a political solution that leads to, your path away from conflict. So, I learned a lot, but it was a tough and hostile environment.
Yeah. Now looking back, what do you think you've learned there? So, and your third challenge is basically, now I'm kind of gathering the wisdom of being an Olympian as well as a war diplomat, and I'm trying to think, what do you think from the war diplomat part? What about humans did you learn that you can convey to others?
Anything? I mean, one of the really interesting things about the team I was in that was very profound was how much we supported each other. And how much we were able to be vulnerable. I mean, obviously, we're away from families. Nobody's got any families with you in what is clearly, not a normal situation. And we, every day there would be sort of sirens going off, people in different places. And we had this sort of checking up. We had radios. We'd be in sort of small groups. We'd always be, whenever there was a kind of siren went off and you had to take cover, you had to get on the ground, you had to put your helmet, make sure your jacket was on, get to a sort of safe place, as it were, if you were anywhere out in the open. And you were always sort of checking up on each other. Where are you? How are you doing? What's happening? We would always check in at the end of the day, often at the beginning of the day, in a very, really, how are you doing? Because there's an expectation that if you're not finding this hard, then there's something really wrong with you. It's okay. And that at different times, people would struggle with it and suddenly go, I was fine yesterday, but today I'm just feeling really anxious. And if you don't get the support quickly, then, quickly you become unable to do your job. And next minute you're sort of taken, got to leave. And that's obviously not helpful to the work either. So we really prioritised looking after each other, even though the work never stopped. There was no breaks. It's not as if we're sitting around having cups of tea going, how are you feeling? Because there's always the next meeting, and how are you going to respond to the latest attacks, and, what's the next kind of... So it's literally you're working all the time, but we always prioritize looking after each other. And I found that really interesting, because then when I came back and I was working in Whitehall in London, it was so stark to me how nobody ever asked me how I was, or if they did, it was in a very superficial way. They didn't really care. They just said it, left it in the air. How are you doing? They weren't looking in my eyes and kind of going, how are you today, Kath? And what's going on for you? And what can I do to support you and help you? And so that is one of the kind of really, what was such a moving experience, to be part of a team where people really cared for each other, where it was totally okay to be vulnerable. And I think it enabled us to not just survive in a difficult situation, but to be very creative in the work that we had to be, where every day things are changing, it's very volatile, you've got to come up with a different solution because yesterday's solution is blown out of the water for whatever reason. And so you need to be quite agile in your thinking. And so for me, I saw how critical that is, and how often in organisations we just don't really support or look out for each other, or feel that someone's got your back. And I think that is so important to, enjoying yourself, but also being resilient in a meaningful way, in a real way, as opposed to I'm just getting on with what I've been given.
Yeah, I'm again going back into the Rolodex of previous interviews, but we spoke to the director of the Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence.
Oh, yeah.
And he speaks about the value of saying, how are you, but also giving it a genuine answer.
Yeah.
He says, we wouldn't know how to answer it anymore. And how come we don't know that? There's such tremendous value in asking that question and in giving it a good answer, and really taking that, 20 seconds or 1 minute or whatever time it is to genuinely ask someone how they are doing, right? They always make the joke in London, if you say hi to someone kind of on the street, they think you want to mug them, right? You just don't do that, right? Here in the north.
Certainly not on the tube. Certainly
not on a tube or whatever. It's like, it's almost not done, right? And you just wonder why, what made us this way. We feel it's intrusive almost. It's like, mind your own business.
We somehow think it's professional. I think there is years of a kind of cultural, social learning around what we think we ought to be like, but it utterly misunderstands what it is to be a human. And that's the problem, because it's not just, I'm not going to do it. Actually, it's harming me by not doing it, because I need it.
100%.
And so I'm cutting myself off. And I think we don't see that damage as clearly as we might to understand why we could do something different. It's a tuning into ourselves and to others. You should be very present to ask that question, and to ask it and to answer it genuinely. It's very simple, but you just need to be present. But of course, we're not present. We're thinking about a million other things. We've got our phones on. We're looking at other windows. And so if we're not present, it's really hard to connect. Ultimately, it's very hard to do good work. Certainly if you need to be creative or collaborative or to connect with others, if relationships at the heart of what we do, which of course is the case in education, diplomacy, many of our worlds, then, this lack of being able to be present is a real lost skill that we have to find a way back to.
I don't know about you, but I am someone who really loves a true crime series. I just can't get enough of them. If I watch them on the streaming platforms, I really cannot stop binging on them. It really is a guilty pleasure. So if you're like me, then you are going to love coldcaseinc.com, which is a platform that offers you unsolved cases of fictional murder mysteries that you can solve. It's a great community of detectives that come together, offering you video and audio evidence, and step by step you can play the game of solving this murder mystery by yourself. We've paired up with the team at coldcaseinc.com, and if you use our code, which is the word MESSY in capital letters, MESSY, then you even get a 15% off your first online membership. So do check out coldcaseinc.com and get crime solving today. We are very happy to be partnering with The Code Zone, which is this amazing platform where people can come together to learn how to code. Creators and future makers, they all come together here, both children as well as adults, to learn how to code and develop things, like for instance their own videos or Minecraft mods. The team at CodeZone believes everyone should be able to learn how to code, young or old, and they've got these amazing subscriptions, very easy and very cheap. You'll learn a lot from them. You could do it live, or you could do it in your own time at your own leisure. We highly recommend it. They are tailored to support individual interests and capabilities, and I'm sure that once you get hooked on the CodeZone, you never want anything more. Check it out, thecodezone.co.uk, or the URL in our show notes. Yeah, so and that brings me to the third challenge, because basically all your wisdom gathered in you training people, coaching people, also a wonderful book called The Long Win. But that also is not without its challenges, right? So in training people, and well, first of all, I think it's almost difficult to, you have such an enormous resume, so kind of such great achievements, and trying to bring that together. And you've attempted. I watched your TED Talk, which I would highly recommend people to look at. But what is the first reaction you get when you kind of, after coaching someone? What do people tell you?
So, I mean, it's interesting. I think, I come with an approach that challenges people. Yeah. And if they want that, then mostly people just feel, I've enabled them to see things that were hidden in plain sight, that, there's a relief, there's an opportunity, there's a sort of, wow, my mind is blown because I'm sort of operating at quite a shallow level, but I kind of know I need to get here. But of course, there are some people who are frightened or closed off to that. And I think, for me, it's really important that I'm not interested in, sometimes I'll be invited just to come and do a, motivational talk. And, because that's going to re-engage people. But, although my talks are great, but, a single talk is not going to re-engage a company. Yeah. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how to motivate your people. And I'd far rather engage with a leader on helping them to understand how to connect and create a sense of purpose for their people than to just give a series of talks or somehow to combine the two. And for me, that's the more interesting opportunity and work that I enjoy, where actually, it's not about, my stories highlight some elements that we've explored, but it's then about the application of what does that mean for you? What's your story? Again, we've all been on this journey of being challenged and learnt things about ourselves. And how do we really bring that to the fore in what we're doing? And how do we start to set goals, metrics, which of course I often find are getting in the way of this, but meaningful metrics, human metrics, that will help us to set a different set of goals. Not, that's more likely to help us achieve the things that we're trying to achieve, anyway, but we're kind of setting up this framework around it. Like we said, it's not just about the medal, it's about what we're also going to gain and take into the next race or the next Olympics or the next part of our lives. And by enhancing those human elements, we've got a better chance of getting the medal. And, we take things with us. So it's about, often I find metrics are very temporary again. They're a set of sales figures, or they're a set of, whatever it is, exam results. And, the sense is, but what are we wrapping around that? That means those exam results are meaningful once the paper's been screwed up, or the email, or however they come now. Then what? What are you actually taking with you? Who have you become through that process? What have you learnt about yourself that maybe isn't on that piece of paper, that's really crucial to how you apply and make use of what's on that piece of paper? And so it's building out this sense of, the long win, I call it, redefining success. What is it we're chasing? Are we chasing the wrong thing? Are we trying to get up a ladder that's on the wrong wall? So, peeling back some layers there. And I think people find that really helpful because they got often trapped into a short-term metric, a metric set by somebody else, a metric that's a number or a letter, but it's not something human. And so just some simple reframing there can also, help us shift the environments we create, the experiences we create for others, and to think in a more qualitative way about our work environments. not just, the latest figures.
Yeah. And you also do work in schools and with sports people in schools or school principals. Is there a different approach that you would apply to a school setting? Or would you say, well, it's very similar to what I see within other types of organizations?
Yeah, I think the same trap exists that there are these short-term, quite narrow measures that seem to be all-powerful, when in fact every teacher has gone into the profession to, give those children the best opportunity for life, and that isn't something that is easily encapsulated on a single page. And so it's ensuring that, of course, they have to play that game, but they don't only have to play that game. And again, how can they create an environment within which they are perhaps producing some other success measures alongside that? And again, in school sport, you have that obvious trap of just trying to win the local league. In actual fact, you're trying to set your children up to lead a healthy life. And I often sort of encourage schools to start saying, really, your success measure is not how many cups you win this year. It's whether your children are still active in 10 years' time. And that's the data you should be starting to collect. That's the bigger game. And do you know what? On the way to that, you probably, you'll win a cup every now and then. You're never going to win them all the time. So what a kind of crazy thing to be chasing. There's there are broader things that you could gain. And again, helping sort of head teachers think about what's the culture that is needed to help teachers deal with the enormous pressures, but ensure we don't lose sight of that bigger purpose, even when it feels like government and metrics and all the other things are not asking for them for that. We know that that's why education exists. And that's really what the teachers are kind of motivated by and dedicated to. And so the more we can tap into that, the better. And head teachers have enormous influence on the experience of a school, of a set of teachers. And I've seen lots, both, as a parent and in the work I do. And so that's a great opportunity. Yes, we're all going to follow the same curriculum, but the children can have such a different range of experiences. So let's really set some goals around the experiences we want to create.
I think that's wonderful. I really like what you say is like the award in and of itself can never be a metric, right? The awards will come and go. That's not a metric. It's like what's indeed the title of your book. What's the long game here? What do you really want to go for? And then the awards will come, right? That's not what it should be about. But unfortunately, I mean, I think media or our brain works like we get excited by that's the hook, that's the like on Facebook, that's the endorphin, is the award, so we confuse it. It's not, but it shouldn't be considered as a building block, but for some reason we do.
It's that gambling part of our brain. We have to recognise that, understand that, go, great, that feels good, but actually it'll feel even better for longer if I, so we're working with the systems alongside rather than letting that one take over and dominate.
And just this is also one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, because I felt that when we speak about success, then it needs to be so short. It can only be in 140 characters. People need to kind of summarize their entire career, years and years of work. And of course, they can then only talk about their achievements and their rewards, right? So everyone thinks, specifically the younger generation, it's up for grabs. You just become an Olympian. Of course, that happens overnight. It's like, no. Actually, blood, sweat, and tears, loads of failure, loads of times that it didn't work, loads of setbacks, people who are over-competitive with each other, psychological stress, all this pain. And then there was the award, exactly your story. And I don't feel that media formats, specifically social media formats, they don't lend themselves to basically project that story, to really tell people, like, if you want to be successful as an Olympian or as a war diplomat, here's what you need to do. Here's the real story, right? And, if it doesn't fit in 140 characters, then so be it. Then those 140 characters are incorrect, not the other way around, right? And I think that's what we need to fight against, basically saying, well, if you want a real story, if you want to go for the long win, then let's sit down and take the time to really understand how you achieve certain things and what genuine success is.
The growth of the podcast industry shows that there is a desire for stories that are longer and more meaningful, and so I take encouragement from that. We want stories. That's actually so powerful. It's how we learn. It's what stays with us. It's what we tell at any stage of our life. It's what we look back on, as we get older. And so, I'm always encouraging within organizations for people to be thinking about the stories. What's the story of your school? What's the story of your business? What are the stories people tell within your school? And to be highlighting those, to be having those on the walls. Actually, that's what we're about. So keeping those stories alive, and podcasts like this obviously play a really important role, and people want that.
Yeah, wonderful. My very last question before my three standard last questions. Sorry. The role of failure, because what I think you must have encountered loads of failure, as you encountered success. What does failure mean to you?
So, it's inescapable. And I've always just found failure very motivating, very fascinating, very irritating, but always a sort of, how did I miss something? What did I not get here? What did I think, probably the exception is in Sydney, I kind of got into this spiral of, failure is, I'm no good. And that was a terrible place to be. But, prior to that, as someone who reads a lot, who enjoys learning about, just got multiple interests, then, for me, failure just provokes my curiosity more to go, well, what do I need to do differently? How might I do this differently? And that's sort of part of who I am. And so I find failure really quite motivating, and it provokes my curiosity to kind of dig in further and see, is there another way, and to understand something more deeply. So, it's a given. And I think it's just a really useful learning tool. And certainly I can look back on that little black moment after Sydney of where, ultimately that was a provocation to think differently. But it just took me about a year to get my head sorted in order to do that. When I got to that point, then it was like, okay, now I've really proved that way does not work for me, but I think I could do things another way. And it was a huge driver again.
I think that's very interesting, and I think that's great wisdom here, that we should be bold enough to isolate our failures. We shouldn't talk about failures only when we can talk about our success, because often when we speak about failure, it's a segue to talk about success, right? But as you say, like, if you were able to isolate Sydney, what happened in Sydney before you went to Athens, then you were wise enough to say, okay, even if I don't go to Athens, then I can still understand where it went wrong, and I can still become a better person from understanding the things that happened in Sydney. And I think very often when we speak about it, people say, well, I'm happy to talk about my failures, but only if I can talk about my success. And I think, well, that's not really talking about failure, really. That's more like using it as an excuse to showcase the success that you had. Whereas I think we should all be bold enough to say, here's where I failed.
Yeah, period. I think, in a way, a lack of failure is usually just haven't really tried anything particularly difficult. So, in my mind, that's not a great place to be. And, we have a limited amount of time, and we want to try some stuff, and we want to learn some stuff, and we've got to get failing as part of that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kath. My very last three questions, and this will go fast, so don't worry. Could you finish the following sentence for me? As a child, I wanted to become a... Deep sigh.
That is so hard. My immediate recollection is I wanted to become a supermarket checkout person.
Oh, there you go. My little brother as well. And why?
Well, I guess it was just that point. It looked such an exciting job because you were like chatting to people, and you had this lovely kind of till to play with buttons, and they always seemed really cheery, and they were always really lovely to me. So I don't know, aged 4 or something. I'm not someone who wanted to be an astronaut or had, and I guess later in life, but I wouldn't say as a child, like as a teenager, coming into university years, then I was really interested in this diplomatic world. But that's the one that comes to mind, I'm afraid.
Nice. Yeah, my little brother's reasoning also at age 4 was, then I will always have money. Because he just saw these people always.
Yes.
It's just like, so I would have no money worries because I'm always sitting in a place where people give me money. Yeah, I've got this still.
Full of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that was his reasoning. So, which I thought was very clever of him at age 4, right? So yeah, but the social, you like the social element.
For me, it was more the social and maybe the food as well.
The food, yeah. Wonderful. The next question is around reading. You just said, I love reading. Which book, and I know this is a difficult one, but which book hasn't inspired you the most on your journey, or author, or, is there any book you could recommend to our listeners?
Oh, that is really hard. I read a lot. I love books, and I have sort of different favourite books at different times. I mean, when I was, I think someone who really helped my thinking when I was starting to write the book, and it took me many years to write the book, and I met her as well, is the writer, thinker, author, Margaret Heffernan. I don't know if you've come across her at all. She ran some businesses. She's actually, again, has very diverse talent. She writes plays, and she's a professor now at the Bath Business School, and she writes about issues of culture, topics of culture. She has an amazing TED Talk about the pecking order, so I'd really recommend that. And all of her books, one is about willful blindness, fascinating and very pertinent to our political world these days. One is about the bigger prize, and it was probably the only book really that had started to go into the area that I was thinking about, where collaboration can be much better than competition. Yeah. And she recently wrote one a couple of years ago called Uncharted. So I would recommend her books, her thinking, her TED Talks. Margaret Heffernan.
Margaret Heffernan. Okay, that's we'll include that in our show notes, and we'll bring it back to our audience. And then the very last question. Now let's turn the tables. This is no longer Messy and Masterful, but the Cath Bishop podcast. And I don't know if you are a podcaster, but I highly recommend you do, because I love it. But who would be high on your list as a guest, or who would be your first guest?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, one of the I would want to do a podcast around stories of success, broadening our concept of it. And I think we often get it wrong by inviting Olympians onto things, when actually I would interview the Olympians who didn't win a medal, but who I think, I know in my own situation, I learned massively from the people around me. They were as dedicated as I was, at least as dedicated, at least as talented, and maybe just, they got injured at the wrong time, or they just weren't tall enough, so they didn't have enough leverage. Often it's things totally beyond their control. I wasn't really, tiny margins that I may have performed better than them, but I learned from them. I couldn't have done it without them, and they exhibited all the values and all the things that I learned and took with me. But we often don't hear from the people who finish lower down, and so I would sort of maybe invite some of the people who I think have excelled, who understand high performance, but maybe they didn't get the medal. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And we could set that up. That's a great idea, and I think you can learn a lot from it. Most definitely, and also as an appreciation for their hard work, because you say, it's often forgotten, and as we kind of also highlighted in this interview, it isn't about the award, right? It's about their journey, and that's what we, that's the long win, right? That's what we learn from.
I think there's a lot of value for us and for others to kind of connect with.
Yeah. Cath, thank you so much for your time. This was really a wonderful interview, and we could talk for hours. So you're always welcome to come back. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you all the best in your further endeavors. If you want to know more about Cath Bishop, you can go to our show notes where there's the link to her site, or you can read her wonderful book, The Long Win. I think, Cath, you are really the personification of the messy and the masterful, which is the title of this podcast. Yeah. So thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom. Cath Bishop.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the chat very much.
If you liked this episode, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Philip Anderson for our beautiful theme music. This episode was edited by Natalie Piles with production assistance from Genta Metalia.